The V-2 rocket was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It fell from the edge of space at supersonic speed, striking London and Antwerp without warning. No sirens, no defense, only silence before impact. Thousands of civilians were slaughtered in an instant, and the survival rate for anyone caught near a strike was horrifyingly low. Yet the real tragedy was darker still. More people died building the V-2 in slave labor tunnels than were ever killed by its explosions. Even for Germany, it was a weapon that drained billions of marks, countless lives, and delivered almost nothing in return. This was not just a terror weapon, it was a machine of death for all sides. And by the end of this story, you'll see why the wonder weapon was one of the most catastrophic failures in history. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe for more World War II stories that reveal the terrifying truths hidden behind the battlefield. The V-2 rocket was born in secrecy on the Baltic coast at a remote testing site called Peenemünde. There, under armed guard, teams of engineers led by Werner von Braun labored to create what they called the A4, a missile that could climb into the edge of space before plummeting down on its target at supersonic speed. In Hitler's desperate imagination, it would be the miracle weapon that would turn the war back in Germany's favor. But behind the clean lines of the rocket's design lay filth, blood, and death. To build it, the Reich poured billions of marks into research and development, even as soldiers at the front begged for rifles and tanks. Entire factories were gutted to supply liquid oxygen plants and gyroscope machinery. Thousands of prisoners from Buchenwald were shipped to Mittelbau-Dora, a concentration camp hidden in the Harz Mountains, where they were forced to work deep inside tunnels. They carved chambers in rock by hand, chained together, starving, beaten. In those suffocating caverns, men died by the hundreds each week. By war's end, at least 20,000 prisoners would perish, producing Hitler's miracle. At Peenemünde, the first test flights were spectacular but unstable. Some rockets exploded on the pad, killing technicians outright. Others flew off course and detonated harmlessly in the sea. Yet for the Nazi propaganda machine, even failure was paraded as progress. They filmed launches, edited the footage, and presented them as triumphs. Hitler himself visited in 1943, staring at the rocket's frame with glazed eyes, declaring it the weapon that would crush London into submission. Engineers toasted champagne after successful flights. None of them spoke of the screams from Dora's tunnels, or of the fact that each launch consumed lives like fuel. By the time the design was declared operational in 1944, the V-2 stood as both a marvel of engineering and a monument to human suffering. What Germany had birthed was not just a weapon, it was a monster built on corpses, waiting to be unleashed. On September 8, 1944, the first V-2 fell on London. It struck without warning, slamming into the city with a blast so powerful it leveled entire buildings in seconds. Unlike the V-1 buzz bomb, which rattled overhead before crashing, the V-2 gave no sound, no siren. It traveled faster than the speed of sound. By the time anyone heard it, it had already exploded. For Londoners who had endured years of Luftwaffe bombing, this was a new nightmare. At least with the Blitz, there had been a chance to run to the shelters. Now, there was nothing. The attacks continued day after day, week after week. Nearly 1,400 rockets were launched against London in just a few months. Each one carried a 1-ton warhead, flattening homes, shops, schools, hospitals. In Woolworth's department store at New Cross, 168 civilians were killed in an instant, many of them women and children shopping for Christmas goods. Firemen who arrived at the scene described bodies buried under rubble, limbs sticking out from crushed walls, and the haunting cries of the trap. One survivor recalled that the smell of dust and blood lingered for weeks after the wreckage was cleared. The survival rate for anyone near the impact zone was appallingly low. Buildings collapsed inward like dominoes, trapping families before they had a chance to flee. Doctors reported injuries unlike anything they had seen before. Bodies hurled across streets, organs ruptured by shock waves, entire crowds obliterated in silence. Even hardened soldiers returning from the front shuddered at the destruction. Worse still was the psychological toll. People in London began living with the constant dread of the unknown. There was no no warning siren to give them seconds of preparation, no buzzing engine to hint at danger. The V-2's terror was in its invisibility. Every quiet evening walk, every trip to the market, every lull in the night carried the same thought. This could be the last moment. London had endured firestorms before, but this weapon was something else. It was death from the heavens, and there was no defense against it. After London, Antwerp became the prime target. The Allies had liberated the city in September 1944, securing one of Europe's most critical ports. It was the lifeline for food, ammunition, and fuel pouring into the front lines. Hitler knew that choking Antwerp meant starving the Allied advance, so German launch crews turned their sights on Belgium, unleashing a storm of rockets unlike anything seen before. The V-2s came relentlessly. More than 1,600 were fired at Belgium, and Antwerp bore the brunt of the assault. The city was battered almost daily, with rockets obliterating entire streets in a heartbeat. On December 16, 1944, a single strike turned the Rex Cinema into a tomb. Families had gathered for an afternoon film, believing they could escape the misery of war for a few hours. When the V-2 hit, 567 people were killed instantly. The blast ripped through the theater, tearing bodies apart, collapsing walls, and setting fires that burned the trapped alive. Survivors staggered from the ruins in shock, their clothes in flames, their voices hoarse from screaming. It was the deadliest rocket strike of the war, a massacre hidden in the heart of a city. Allied troops stationed in Antwerp were also frequent victims. American soldiers awaiting deployment were killed by the dozens in their barracks, vaporized before they ever reached the front. The strikes rattled morale, reminding even hardened fighters that death could come without warning. Officers wrote reports filled with disbelief. The terror is greater than bombing, for there is no warning, no defense, only sudden annihilation. Antwerp's civilians lived in constant dread. Children were afraid to go to school, knowing classrooms had already been leveled. Families huddled in basements, but even the thickest stone offered little protection against the rocket's force. The city, once a place of liberation, had become a place of relentless funerals. And as rockets fell night after night, the Allies realized this wasn't just a military threat. It was psychological warfare, and Antwerp was drowning in its flames. What made the V-2 rocket more horrifying than any weapon before, it was not just its power, it was its silence. Air raids during the Blitz had been terrifying, but they carried warning signs: the wail of sirens, the drone of engines, the whistle of bombs falling through the sky. The V-2 gave nothing. It struck faster than sound. People only realized they were targets when the world around them erupted. Witnesses described the experience as surreal. One moment, Londoners strolled through markets or children played in the streets. The next, buildings vanished, the ground shook, and a fireball consumed entire blocks. Survivors spoke of losing friends mid-sentence, one half of a conversation simply gone. Doctors described patients hurled across rooms, bones shattered, organs ruptured, often without a single scratch visible on the outside. It was invisible death, descending from above like lightning with no storm. This lack of warning destroyed morale in ways even the Luftwaffe had failed to do. Families no longer trusted shelters because there was no time to reach them. People began living in a state of constant paranoia, listening to silence as though it were a threat. The quiet moments before dawn or the stillness of an evening walk became unbearable. As one survivor later said, "You felt safe when you heard noise. Silence was the danger." Even the Allies admitted they were powerless. Radar could detect a rocket's launch, but only after it was already airborne. By then, there were seconds before impact, far too late. Fighters were too slow to intercept. Anti-aircraft guns could not reach the rocket's altitude. Civilians understood this truth quickly. No one could stop a V-2. The psychological effect was devastating. It created not just casualties, but a society paralyzed by helplessness. For those who lived through it, the memory of the silence never faded. The rockets taught them that death did not always announce itself. It could arrive in stillness, leaving behind only rubble. screams, and dust. That was the true terror of the V-2. While London and Antwerp burned, an even greater tragedy unfolded far from the front lines. To mass-produce the V-2, the Nazis carved a secret underground factory into the Harz Mountains at Nordhausen, known as Mittelbau Dora. Here, thousands of concentration camp prisoners were forced into the tunnels, building rockets under conditions so inhumane that the factory itself became a death camp. The tunnels were dark, damp, and suffocating. Prisoners worked 12 to 18 hours a day, with almost no food, no medical care, and constant beatings from SS guards. They slept on wooden bunks, stacked 5 high, crammed into filthy chambers filled with disease. Many collapsed from exhaustion at their workstations, only to be dragged away and replaced. Guards hanged prisoners who faltered, suspending their bodies from cranes as warnings. The air was thick with dust and smoke, leaving thousands to die of pneumonia and lung infections. The death toll was staggering. Out of 60,000 prisoners sent to Dora, at least 20,000 perished. More people died building the V-2 than were killed by the rockets themselves. For every missile launched, dozens of lives were consumed in the tunnels. Prisoners would later recall seeing corpses stacked like firewood, carried away daily in carts. Others spoke of watching friends collapse and never rise again, their bodies tossed aside like broken machines. The irony was cruel. While Nazi propaganda bragged that the V-2 would bring vengeance on the Allies, its construction slaughtered Germany's own enslaved workforce. Engineers like Werner von Braun visited Dora to inspect production, ignoring the moans of the dying. To them, the prisoners were not human beings, but expendable cogs in the machine of war. The Mittelbau Dora tunnels stand today as memorials, but during the war, they were hell itself, proof that the V-2 was not just a weapon of destruction, but a factory of death. Every rocket that thundered into the sky carried with it the screams of those who never saw the light again. Behind the V-2 program stood Werner von Braun, a man whose name would one day be celebrated as the father of modern rocketry. In Nazi Germany, however, he was known as the brilliant engineer who gave Hitler his wonder weapon. Ambitious and charismatic, von Braun had dreamed of space travel since childhood, sketching rockets that could one day reach the moon. But in the Third Reich, those dreams were shackled to a darker purpose. Von Braun joined the SS and worked directly under Heinrich Himmler's regime. At Peenemünde, he oversaw the technical development of the A4 rocket, ensuring it could climb into the stratosphere and plunge down on cities hundreds of miles away. His brilliance was undeniable, but so was his complicity. He visited Mittelbau Dora, where prisoners wasted away to build his rockets, yet later claimed he saw nothing unusual. Survivors remembered him walking through the tunnels, flanked by officers, ignoring the skeletal men who collapsed at his feet. After the war, von Braun denied responsibility, insisting he was only a scientist forced to serve the regime. But documents revealed he lobbied for more laborers, knowing full well they came from concentration camps. To the Allies, however, von Braun was too valuable to punish. Through Operation Paperclip, he was whisked to the United States, where his genius fueled the American space program. The same man who built the V-2 that slaughtered civilians in London would go on to design the Saturn V rocket that carried astronauts to the moon. This moral paradox haunts history. Was von Braun a visionary dreamer trapped by circumstance, or a willing servant of terror? What is certain is that his rockets left a trail of corpses before they ever pointed toward the stars. For those who survived the V-2's wrath, von Braun's legacy was not the triumph of Apollo 11. It was the thunder of a weapon that murdered without warning. For those who survived a V-2 strike, life was never the same. Unlike the Blitz, where the drone of planes gave warning, the V-2 arrived in silence. Civilians described the experience as pure terror. One moment, laughter and conversation. The next, bodies flung across streets, buildings collapsing, lives extinguished in a flash. Survivors of Woolworths in New Cross spoke of hearing nothing but the ceiling groan before the entire store collapsed, leaving hundreds buried. Doctors working in London hospitals said the injuries were grotesque, far beyond what they had seen in previous air raids. Shockwaves tore lungs, ruptured eardrums, and hurled limbs like rag dolls. But the physical wounds were only part of the horror. The psychological environmental damage was deeper. Children grew up flinching at loud noises, convinced another rocket was about to strike. Parents lay awake at night, listening to silence as if it were a predator stalking outside. Some became fatalistic, muttering that survival was just luck, while others sank into despair, terrified to leave their homes. Soldiers stationed in Antwerp confessed in letters home that they would rather face artillery on the front lines than wait helplessly for a rocket they couldn't stop. The randomness made it unbearable. A rocket might miss its target by miles, leveling a school instead of a factory. People began to believe survival was meaningless chance. One street destroyed, another untouched, one survivor recalled, and you asked yourself, why them and not me? This survivor's guilt lingered for decades, passed silently through families who lost entire generations in a single blast. The V-2 did not just kill bodies, it shattered minds. Long after the war ended, veterans, civilians, and children of the Blitz carried invisible scars. For them, the rocket's silence was louder than any explosion, a reminder that death could fall from the sky at any moment, without reason, without mercy, and without warning. By 1945, the truth about the V-2 program was clear. It had been a catastrophic waste. The Nazis had poured up to 2 billion Reichsmarks into the project, a sum so vast it rivaled the Allies' entire Manhattan Project. With that money, Germany could have built thousands of tanks, planes, or submarines. Yet Hitler had gambled it all on rockets that promised miracles but delivered only terror. The results were damning. Around 3,000 V-2 rockets were launched, delivering roughly 3,000 tons of explosives. To put that in perspective, a single Allied bombing raid on Hamburg or Dresden could drop 10 times that in one night. Strategically, the V-2 achieved nothing. It could not stop the Allied advance. It could not destroy supply lines. Its inaccuracy was so great that rockets often landed in empty fields rather than intended targets. In military terms, it was a failure, but the cost in human lives was staggering. Roughly 5,000 civilians were killed by V-2 strikes in London, Antwerp, and other cities. Far more, at least 20,000, perished building the rockets in the tunnels of Dora. Each launch represented dozens of dead laborers, their bodies buried in the earth while their work soared skyward to kill strangers. The vengeance weapon destroyed more Germans and enslaved prisoners than it ever did enemies. Even Nazi officials admitted the weapon's futility. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, later confessed that the resources spent on the V-2 could have decided the war in 1943 had they been directed elsewhere. Instead, the Reich wasted its dying breath on rockets that delivered terror without victory. The V-2 was vengeance in name only. In truth, it was desperation, a monument to wasted lives, wasted resources, and wasted time. For Germany, it was proof that obsession with wonder weapons could doom an entire nation. For the world, it was a warning that technology built on cruelty will always come at a price greater than any warhead. By March 1945, the V-2 campaign sputtered to its end. Launch sites lay in ruins, fuel was scarce, and Allied armies were closing in on Germany from both east and west. Yet the weapon's legacy was only beginning. The Allies raced to seize what remained: rocket parts, blueprints, and above all, the men who had built them. In a secret effort called Operation Paperclip, more than 1,000 German scientists, including Werner von Braun, were taken to the United States. There, the same man who once designed weapons for Hitler now designed the Saturn V that carried astronauts to the moon. In the Soviet Union, captured engineers helped lay the foundation for intercontinental missiles. The age of space travel was born in the shadow of a weapon meant for terror. But for survivors, the legacy was far darker. In London, Antwerp, and across Belgium, families carried wounds that never healed. Entire neighborhoods had vanished in a heartbeat. Civilians lived with nightmares of sudden blasts, of silence, shattered by fire. At Dora, the ghosts were countless. The tunnels where men had died building rockets remained littered with the bones of prisoners long after the war. Memorials were later erected, but the air inside those caverns still felt heavy with suffering. For many survivors, the war ended in 1945, but the memories of the rockets never stopped falling. Historians today call the V-2 both a marvel of engineering and a crime against humanity. It killed indiscriminately, delivered no military advantage, and consumed the lives of those forced to build it. It showed how science, when corrupted by cruelty and ideology, becomes not a tool of progress, but a machine of destruction. The V-2 was vengeance only in name. In truth, it was a warning from history that unchecked ambition and blind obedience can unleash horrors that haunt generations. Even now, standing at the ruins of Dora or the memorial at New Cross, one can feel the silence that terrified millions. It is the silence before the blast, the silence of lives stolen, the silence that still echoes when we ask, was it worth the cost?